2 years ago, I received an acceptance letter from one of my dream universities, along with the amazing news that I had been awarded a scholarship. It felt like the stars had aligned for me because I had been working part-time in order to be responsible and save as much money as I could in order to prepare for college. My parents used my hard-earned college savings to spoil my pregnant sister, and now she has abandoned her son at their doorstep and asked me to raise him, cushion a college fund that I could rely on in case I needed money for unforeseen expenses. Or if the scholarship didn't cover everything. I didn't want to leave things up to chance, so I decided to save hard. Getting accepted to college was already a success, but getting a scholarship felt like an extra stroke of luck, as if all my hard work had finally paid off in the best way possible. I was therefore pleased that the college fund I had been saving up could now be used for any. I was still very young and didn't have my own bank account, so for convenience, the money I made from my part-time job was deposited straight into my mother's salary account. I had complete faith in her with it, and I always thought that when I eventually left for college, my mom would simply return the money to me without question, because I had earned it after all, and it was for my education. But reality turned out to be very different from what I had anticipated. Shortly after I received my scholarship, my parents sat me down to discuss things with me, and casually stated that I no longer needed the money I had been saving for college because I had been fortunate enough to receive one. They explained that, since my tuition would be mostly covered, they wanted to reroute the money I had saved for my older sister's future. I was shocked because I had worked hard to earn this money, and now I was out of pocket. For some background, they never told me that it would be used for my ungrateful sibling. Let me tell you a little bit more about my older sister Caroline. Caroline has always been the troublemaker in the family, unlike me, who has had to work hard and follow the rules. No matter what she does, she always manages to get away with it. She is only 3 years older than me, but you wouldn't think so if you saw how my parents treat her. They act like she's still a little child, and no matter how old she gets, they seemed to Caroline was always the one getting away with things that I never could. I was always reminded to work hard and be responsible, but whenever she made a mistake or did something wrong, my parents, especially my mom, would almost automatically jump to her defense, claiming that her oldest child was to blame. They were determined to shield her from any kind of responsibility or accountability. It's as if they've put her in a bubble where she never has to deal with the real world. My mother always managed to turn things around and make it seem like she was the victim, regardless of whether my sister was obviously at fault or if there were other people involved. For instance, when Caroline was about 14 years old, she was caught bullying younger girls at school. According to the teachers, she had been picking on them for weeks. Things got so bad that the school had to call my parents in for a meeting to discuss Caroline's behavior. Caroline began crying during the meeting, of course, and denied everything. Rather than questioning whether her daughter could truly be at fault, my mother chose to believe her tears over the facts and argued with the teachers, even though the headmistress insisted that Caroline was being unfairly accused. When she learned that her bullying had been witnessed by multiple students and teachers, she flatly refused to accept it, could never be cruel or mean to anyone, and even went so far as to accuse the victims of acting in order to get Caroline into trouble. In the end, Caroline was let go with only a 1-week suspension. But because my mom wouldn't accept the truth, Caroline realized that she didn't really face any consequences, and that she was never reprimanded for her actions. Life continued as if nothing had happened. When my sister Caroline turned 16, things became much worse, and she got herself into even more trouble this time. Discovered smoking at school, which was already against the rules, but it was worse than that. In addition to smoking, she was caught attempting to sell marijuana, which was a much more serious offense. This time, the school administration had unquestionable proof, including witnesses, and it was obvious that Caroline had crossed a line that even my parents couldn't dispute. When the school discovered everything, Caroline was basically expelled, which was a turning point for me. When my mother, who had always been able to shield her from responsibility, found herself unable to talk her way out of the situation or make excuses for Caroline, she immediately went into what I can only describe as damage control mode. Rather than confronting the truth, she refused to allow this incident to damage the image she had created of Caroline as the ideal innocent daughter in this family. In order to give Caroline the best education possible, my mom created a completely different story to tell our family members and relatives. She began by saying that she wanted to send Caroline to a prestigious school far from home, but in reality, Caroline had trouble getting into any local school due to her reputation. My parents were desperate to conceal the truth because they couldn't bear the idea of people learning the truth about their beloved daughter. My mom presented it to others as though she was sending Caroline to a prestigious, pricey boarding school of her own choosing in order to provide her with better opportunities and help her succeed, even though this decision came at a significant financial cost. The posh school was merely a front to protect their reputation, and consequently Caroline's. Caroline had been expelled from school for something as serious as smoking and selling marijuana. Extremely costly, well beyond my parents' means, and they had difficulty paying for it. However, they were prepared to make those sacrifices in order to preserve the perception of Caroline as this affluent, privileged girl who was getting the best education available, far superior to that of everyone else in our neighborhood. It is evident that my parents were prepared to go to great lengths to conceal Caroline's shortcomings and misbehavior, even if it meant straining their own finances. Caroline would have learned her lesson, shown some remorse, or at least tried to change after everything that had happened, including being expelled from school for smoking and selling marijuana. But that wasn't the case at all. Shortly after being sent to that pricey boarding school, my parents received a call one night informing them that Caroline had vanished in the middle of the night, and my sister had left a letter behind in typical dramatic fashion declaring, "My." Parents went into overdrive to find her after learning that she was in love with her ex-boyfriend, Nick, and that she couldn't wait to spend the rest of her life with him. They called her friends and the police in a panic, hoping to find any leads or clues about her whereabouts. Fortunately, after a few stressful days of searching, the police were able to locate Caroline, who had been staying at one of her friends' houses the entire time, when my sister flatly refused to return home when my parents and I went to pick her up. Instead, she told my parents that Nick was the one for her and that she wanted to marry him right away. My parents spent hours trying to talk her out of it, but instead of enforcing the law or insisting that Caroline return to finish school, my mother finally gave in to her demands. After some haggling, they came to an agreement whereby Caroline would return to finish high school, but my parents would support her after she graduated. Decision to marry Nick. They even promised to provide Caroline and Nick with as much financial support as possible after their marriage. Can you believe that? Well, Caroline kept her word and married Nick as soon as she turned 18, forgoing college and concentrating on her future in favor of marrying Nick. My parents, as promised, supported them at every turn, finding a home for Caroline and her new husband to live in, because neither Caroline nor Nick had any stable income to sustain themselves, so my parents ultimately agreed to pay their rent each month. To make things worse, Nick had no parents, so my parents were always responsible for the two of them. I couldn't understand that. Despite all the A1's trouble Caroline had caused, my parents were still going above and beyond to make Caroline's life as comfortable as possible, using their hard-earned money to support her marriage, pay her rent, and this type of favoritism has persisted throughout our lives. No matter what Caroline does, she is always protected. And when my parents decided to take the money I had worked so hard to earn, I couldn't help but feel the growing resentment that I always had to work harder than my sister, who got things for free served on a platter, while I was always told to focus on my studies and encouraged to take a part-time job so I could earn my own money. I confronted them and demanded to know why they were giving Caroline my hard-earned money, which I had been saving for years to help with college. And it didn't make sense to me when my parents revealed the true reason for their decision, that Caroline had recently discovered she was pregnant. My jaw practically dropped in disbelief. I had been saving for my education and giving it to her instead, but it felt like another chapter in the same old story. I was worried about how Caroline would handle having a baby when she couldn't even manage her own life. She and her husband could hardly take care of themselves, let alone a child. However, when I voiced these worries to my parents, my mom dismissed them as though she didn't care about my reaction. My dad proudly declared how happy he was to become a grandfather so soon, and both he and my mom were beaming with excitement, completely unfazed by my reaction to them. My mom said it's so matter of fact, as if this new job would just magically erase all of their financial struggles. And then she dropped the real bombshell. My parents had decided to remove the biggest source of tension in Caroline's life by purchasing a brand new car. She always does this whenever I bring up legitimate concerns about Caroline's bad choices. She casually mentions that Nick, Caroline's husband, recently got a good position, so he would be able to support her and the baby from now on. They wanted to use my money to buy my sister a house so she could start a family in peace. so they gave her and Nick a free apartment. They were willing to make yet another significant financial sacrifice to buy a house so Caroline wouldn't have to worry about anything. I couldn't believe it. It seemed like everything I had worked for, including the late nights and part-time jobs, was insignificant compared to Caroline's most recent life event. It was a moment of realization for me that no matter what I did, I would never receive the recognition or appreciation I deserved. I had never shown this level of pride or excitement about my accomplishments, not even when I was accepted into my dream university on a scholarship. After years of being the responsible, hard-working daughter who did her best to make them proud, I was tired of coming in second to Caroline in every way that mattered to them. I stopped arguing with them after that, because I didn't see the point in trying to reason with people who were so blinded by their favoritism. Instead, I shut down completely emotionally, removing myself from the situation, and patiently waited for my opportunity to leave as soon as my college start date drew near. If they couldn't appreciate me for who I had become, then perhaps it was time for me to stop attempting to win their approval altogether. Even in those last weeks, I could hear my parents discussing their ambitious plans for my bedroom after I left. They were already planning to turn it into a nursery for Caroline's unborn child, their future grandchild. It was as though my existence had been completely erased from their minds. I concentrated on getting ready for that escape, keeping my head down and counting down the days until I could finally move out and leave this toxic dynamic behind. For the first time in years, I felt a great sense of relief after I settled into my new life at college. It had already been planned to be transformed to accommodate a child who hadn't even been born yet, and my parents were practically giddy with excitement about how they could watch Caroline and give her baby a room in their house. However, when the time came to move, my dad didn't even offer to help me pack or move my belongings. Fortunately, I had my friends nearby who helped me move into my dorm. For the past 2 years, I've been concentrating entirely on myself. College has been a busy and rewarding experience. I've worked hard academically while also holding down a part-time job. I'm no longer living under the weight of my parents' favoritism or trapped in a home where my accomplishments and my efforts were taken for granted away from my family. I've finally had the freedom to live my life without constantly being compared to my sister or feeling like I'm not good enough. As a server, and to be honest, I love the life I've created for myself. After I moved out, I felt free from the toxic favoritism that had pervaded my family for so long. As promised, my parents converted my old room into a nursery for Caroline. Baby Jimmy, I've only met him once at the time of his birth, and Caroline and I have never been close, so we don't really talk. Once it became apparent that I had nowhere left at my parents' house, I stopped visiting them completely. They never really checked up on me over the past 2 years unless they needed something from me. And eventually, I came to terms with the fact that this was the way things were. I concentrated on my own life and my own objectives and gave up on the idea that things would ever change. We had been silent for so long that I was truly taken aback when my mother called me earlier this morning. She sounded panicked, her voice shaking, and her first question was, "Has my sister called me?" I was perplexed, so I told her no. Caroline hadn't contacted me yet, so I was shocked when my mother began crying on the other end of the line. I was filled with anxiety as I listened to her sob, and she eventually admitted, in between sobs, that something horrible had happened that morning. It seemed that she and my dad had woken up to the sound of the doorbell ringing frantically, followed by a loud banging on their front door. When they hurried downstairs to investigate, they discovered Jimmy Caroline's. When I asked my mother if the note mentioned anything about where Caroline had gone, or what was going on, she revealed that Caroline had written a note in which she complained that she hated being a mother and couldn't handle this suffocation any longer. My mother was in hysterics as she described how terrifying it was to open the door and find their grandson standing on the porch alone, holding his small bag and a note. Didn't want to raise her son and had asked my parents and me to take over, raising Jimmy from that day on. I was completely shocked by the reality of what was happening, and my mother's sobbing only got worse over the phone as she tried to process it. Meanwhile, my father, who had been frantically attempting to get in touch with Caroline and her husband Nick, abruptly took the phone from her when he told me that both Caroline's and Nick's phones had been turned off, and he explained that this was becoming a very serious situation. He explained that Caroline had asked them for money a few days prior, and that there was a possibility that she had actually fled with the money, leaving her son with us. My father told me it was time for me to return home right away to assist them in their search for Caroline. I was still processing everything and trying to comprehend that my sister had abandoned her child in this way. And although I was worried, I also knew I calmly informed my dad that I couldn't go home just yet because I had a big test this week and I couldn't just drop everything I offered to do. I explained that I tried to contact Caroline on my own, but couldn't be physically there. My dad wasn't pleased with my response at all and began to argue, telling me that I was being unreasonable and that the family needed me with them right now. He spoke as though it was my responsibility to show up, had a moral duty to support them during this crisis simply because we are family. But I wasn't going to let him guilt trip me, so I retorted that my presence wouldn't resolve the issue. I couldn't help but point out that they hadn't needed me. In the previous 2 years, they hadn't once inquired about my needs or how I was doing. Now that they were in a crisis, I was expected to drop everything and rush back to help. But that didn't sit well with me, and I wasn't going to allow them. To make me, I felt bad for concentrating on my own life. And then, my father told me that I was being too hard on them during this crisis. He said that they only needed me to be there for them, and that this was about coming together as a family when things were obviously falling apart, not about the past or any old family issues. He tried to make me feel cold-hearted by not going back to help them right away, as if I were the one abandoning them in their hour of need. AITA. For not letting my father feel guilty. I completely agree that something feels strange about my parents calling me back home, especially since they haven't spoken to me in the past 2 years. My mom, who doesn't call me very often, has been ringing my phone several times a day, almost pleading with me to come back. This doesn't sit well with me, and it's difficult not to suspect that there is some hidden agenda behind it. My sister left her son behind. Urgency about anything previously, so why not now make it clear to some commenters that I truly care about? Jimmy, the thought of my sister leaving her child is heartbreaking, and I feel a great deal of sympathy for him. Caroline's abrupt disappearance and her choice to leave Jimmy at my parents' door is shocking, to put it mildly. But I also know that my parents adore Jimmy, and I have faith that they will look after him, just as they have always gone above and beyond for Caroline. I'm worried that Jimmy won't be taken care of, but I know that my parents will take care of him in the end. What worries me the most, though, is how my sister can suddenly disappear. It's unsettling that she would do something so drastic. And I can't get rid of the feeling that there's more going on than I've been told. I don't understand why my parents are so desperate for me to return home, when in fact, they've never needed my assistance before. And it's been a week since my last update after finishing my college exam. I made the decision to take a break and finally go see my parents. My mom, who had been crying for the past week, had red puffy eyes and appeared to have not slept much. And my dad had a grim, worried expression that made it obvious he was still worried about everything. Jimmy seemed to be doing okay, even though I bought him a small gift and played with him for a while. He was content with my parents, blissfully unaware of the chaos around him, and even seemed to think that his parents were only on vacation and would be back soon after I moved. I knew I needed to sit down with my parents to discuss everything, and I wanted to see the note Caroline had left with Jimmy. As soon as I asked them to show me the note, I saw their worried looks, which made me even more worried. Eventually, my mother reluctantly took the note, and I read it, and I was shocked to discover that they had omitted an important part of my sister went on to write, that she resented the way my parents had raised her, and that she wished she could be more like me, someone who is capable and responsible. She concluded the note by writing that by leaving Jimmy with me, he would have a better chance at a good life, perhaps even a life she wished she could have had. I couldn't believe what I was reading, but Caroline hadn't just abandoned her son with my parents. She had specifically left him for me. When my parents bought them a nice apartment to live in, Nick and Caroline began to turn to drugs and neglect their parental duties. Even after Jimmy was born, my parents caught them several times leaving Jimmy alone at home, even as a baby, while they went out to party without him. This made my heart race and made me want to know what the hell was going on and why my sister had left me her son. That's when everything changed. Hearing all of this felt like hearing a story about a stranger. I mean, I've always known my sister causes trouble, but I had assumed that at least as a parent, she would have given up on these things. But obviously she hadn't. Caroline would frequently show up at my parents' doorstep crying for help with Jimmy in her arms, and they would also have violent fights late into the night because of their drug use. Recognize that I would criticize them for helping Caroline through all of this bullshit. They had done everything they could to help her, including trying to get her into rehab, but she kept relapsing. At one point, my sister, desperate for cash, for drugs, turned to stealing from them, which is when my parents realized how dangerous things had gotten for both Caroline and Jimmy. They had to defend their grandson and protect him because they were in a position to do so, where they felt compelled to protect their grandson, and my parents threatened to contact Child Protection Detective Services against my sister and her husband and have them arrested for failing to care for their son. It appears that this threat was what finally broke Caroline's back. She had been struggling to be a parent for a long time, and the threat made it impossible for her to continue. A week prior to her disappearance, she asked our parents for a loan and then abruptly left. Jimmy was on their doorstep when he disappeared, and my parents informed me that it was obvious that she and Nick were done being parents because they had purposefully left their son on their porch, and both of their phones were unreachable. My parents had reported them missing, and the police were contacted, but even they thought Caroline and Nick had probably left their kids voluntarily, possibly to continue using drugs, which seemed all too likely given the situation. As I took it all in, my parents continued by explaining that this was the main reason they wanted me to return home. They obviously could not come out and tell me the whole truth on the phone, because they were afraid of how I would react to everything. My dad then began to explain how he and mom were getting older, and I felt a mixture of anger and heartbreak. It was evident that my sister had been suffering for a long time, but I had been left completely in the dark. He thought it was a great idea for me to move back in with them and work on taking Caroline's place in Jimmy's life, even though they enjoyed watching him for a few hours. My mother nodded in agreement, saying that I could probably drop out of college and raise Jimmy for the time being, since my sister wanted me to have him. I was shocked and couldn't help but laugh at their suggestion. Had they gone insane? There was no way I was going to drop out to look after my sister's child. I firmly told them that we needed to discuss this with CPS, and that if I didn't want to take legal custody, they could take custody of Jimmy. Given the circumstances, this seemed like the most responsible course of action. My dad quickly resisted, claiming that this was a family matter, and that involving CPS could make Jimmy's life more difficult. My mom then added that my sister would be disappointed in me, for I told them that I didn't care about disappointing anyone, but rather about doing what was right for Jimmy and myself. I needed to carefully consider this before rushing into making a decision that could change my life forever. So my parents finally agreed to give me some time to think. Update 3. It's been 2 months since my parents essentially left their son to me and insisted that they and my dad expected better from me. Finally, just to clear up a few things, yes, my sister did write that note, and I know Caroline's handwriting well enough to know that it wasn't a fake. My parents also showed me bank statements that showed how much money they were foolishly sending Caroline each month to help her and her husband. They even took me to Caroline's apartment because they had a key, and empty alcohol bottles were left there, just as my mother had described. I did contact CPS and told them everything I knew about my sister and her husband's situation, and they agreed to temporarily take custody of Jimmy until Caroline or Nick returned. I feel a little better knowing that Jimmy will be safe with my parents for the time being. The refrigerator was nearly empty. Drawers and cupboards were strewn on the floor, and there was a strong stench that overpowered the entire place. Did a lot to make me feel guilty for not caring for Jimmy, but I refused to back down because I knew that no one's interests, least of all Jimmy's, would be served by a decision based on guilt. I told them that I could not allow their other daughters poor life choices to hold me back in my career. I also pointed out to them that they were dealing with the fallout from their own actions. No, my parents haven't apologized yet for using my college funds, but they did express regret for purchasing the apartment for my sister. Just to be clear, the apartment deed is in their name. They were renting out the flat to my sister and her husband, so I assume they will now rent it out and make some additional cash. I'm back at college right now and concentrated on my academics. I'll keep any time I can. I go see Jimmy.